Well, good morning. Today we're going to talk about the beginning of The Handmaid's Tale. Before we get to that, though, I hope you had a chance to watch the AP College Board's review um, yesterday. Going forward, I'm going to try and decide how best to balance what College Board is publishing and then what I'm making. Um, we'll see how that goes. I'll have a plan for you soon. Anyway, let's dive into the novel, shall we?
Margaret Atwood's A Handmaid's Tale today. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about are the epigraphs in the start of the book. The first one, but as to myself, having been wearied out for many years with offering vain, idle, visionary thoughts, and at length utterly despairing of success, I fortunately fell upon this proposal, and that is from the beginning of Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, which, if you recall, and I think you read this in AP language, A Modest Proposal is a satire written in the 17th century, I believe, or 18th century, excuse me, in which the narrator proposes to deal with the famine problems eating babies, right? And this is, of course, satire, and it's one called Reductio ad absurdum, which is where you take a position and reduce it to the point of absurdity through satire to kind of argue the opposite. And this is telling us that The Handmaid's Tale is also going to be this type of satire. Okay, the second one I want to talk about is actually the first epigraph here, and this is from Genesis in the Bible. And this refers to the story of Jacob and Rachel. And a little bit of backstory on this: Jacob had to leave his home after he stole his brother Esau's birthright. Eventually he goes and he stays with his uncle Laban, and he falls in love with Rachel, Laban's second daughter, and he wants to marry her, and Laban says, sure, just work for me for 7 months, or 7 years, excuse me. Jacob says, sure, that's worth it. He does so. They have the marriage ceremony, which, thousands of years ago basically meant entering a tent together. They do at night. Jacob wakes up in the morning and he says, hey, wait a minute, you're not Rachel, you're Rachel's older sister Leah. And so he had actually married Leah, not Rachel. And so he goes to Laban and says, what gives? And Laban said, well, I can't marry my youngest daughter before my oldest. How would that look? Go ahead and work for me for 7 more years, and I will, I'll let you marry Rachel. And he does so, and he marries Rachel. Now Jacob and Leah have a bunch of children together. If you've ever seen the musical Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, right? The majority of those brothers were born to Leah. Joseph was actually born to Rachel. But as it goes, Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children. Rachel envied her sister Leah and said unto Jacob, give me children or else I die. And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, am I in God's stead, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? And she said, behold, my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear upon my knees, and I may also have children by her. Right? And so Jacob does that. He has children with her. Leah's like, oh, well, no, have children with my maid, and blah, blah, blah. And it goes back and forth, and there are all kinds of issues, right, from a modern perspective about this story. And you can see those. There's the polygamy, there's the slavery, all of that. But anyway, this is kind of the basis for the novel. And finally, in the desert, there is no sign that says, thou shalt not eat stones. Which is just to say we don't ever outlaw things that people don't want to do. So the things we ban are things that people want. Okay, I just want to point out the table of contents here. You notice how it's broken up. We have Roman numerals, which are parts, and then each part has a title. And The odd ones are either night or, in one case, nap. So they refer to time when one might sleep. Um, and the others are kind of events. You'll notice, right, again, the Roman numerals. And then finally here, the historical notes at the end. These are fictional, just like the rest of the book. There are no historical notes. This book is totally a work of fiction, though it is, of course, based on real events. But that is part of the novel. Please read them. Okay, the first part is night. I want to point out that, right, that Roman numeral, night. It includes all of the chapters. So when I talk about part 1, I'm talking about all of the chapters in part 1, right? It just so happens that chapter 1 is in part 1, and it is all of part 1. When we get to part 2 has more than just chapter 2, right? And it keeps on going on like that. So we see the situation here in chapter 1. First, we have a we, right? This is the narrator uses that pronoun we, so she's talking about more than just herself. But she's in a gymnasium, right? And we see that they, whoever they are, have left the basketball nets up. The nets are taken down, or the hoops are up, but the nets themselves are gone. Right, and we would ask ourselves, why might this happen? Why might you remove the net? And as we see a little bit later, there are issues facing the people here, that a net perhaps would be an exit from those situations. But we're looking through and we see that there's kind of the memory, right? We have this idea of an after image. And the memories are of school dances, or not necessarily basketball games, but instead school dances. And over the course of time, right, starting with the felt skirted girls, from like the 50s, and later on the mini skirts, and then we get the 80s and the punk and the spiky green hair and that sort of thing, and remembering everything that happened at those kinds of dances, which were both the fun, but also the kind of coupling up, and the romance of it, and the how young people learn about each other, and that sort of yearning. And I won't really talk all that much more about that, but that's what comes to mind. And so in the second part there, we see that, it was in the air, still in the air, an afterthought as we tried to sleep. In the army cots had been set up in rows with spaces between so we could not talk. We had flannelette sheets. Whoops, go back. Anyway, we had flannelette sheets like children, and army issue blankets, ones that still said U.S., right? That tells us one thing, right? The people, the women who are in this gymnasium, are on old army cots. There are spaces. They're not supposed to talk to each other, so they're kind of isolated even all together in that big group. They're not there to talk to each other and be friends, obviously. We also see that they have army issue blankets, ones that still said U.S., which tells us, of course, that the U.S. is no longer here. Oh, there we go. Anyway. And we see that Aunt Sarah and Aunt Elizabeth patrolled, right? And Aunt Sarah and Aunt Elizabeth sound like comforting names, familial names. But, right, we have the juxtaposition of electric cattle prods slung on thongs from their leather belts, which tells us then that they're not necessarily kind, and what's being done here as the women are crammed into this gymnasium is kind of dehumanizing, right? They're cattle prods, normally used for getting cows and herding cows. They did not have guns, though. Only the guards had guns, and the guards were picked from the angels. Angels are kind of like soldiers in this book. We see references here to biblical stories like Noah's Ark, right? So they're allowed on walks, 2 by 2. We'll see why later on. but we see that people aren't allowed in and they aren't allowed out. Right? So they are both imprisoned and being guarded from the inside and outside. And that's there. They hope to get out, right? They wish that some exchange could be made with the angels, some deal made, some trade off. We still had our bodies. That was our fantasy. And that's kind of the hope to get out of there. In the end, they exchange names from bed to bed: Alma, Janine, Dolores, Moira, and June. I point out the last one. We will never find out the narrator's name in this book. In the Hulu series, right, her name is June. And I was talking to Margaret Atwood a couple of years ago, and she said that she had never intended on naming the narrator, but that the readership of this book had decided her name was June. And the reason is because later on this in the novel we'll see Alma, we'll see Janine, we'll see Dolores, and we'll see Moira at some point. We'll never see a character named June, which of course leads readers to say that, well, she must be June, the narrator must be June. Margaret Atwood said basically that the readership has named her that, and consequently that's her name, which is a pretty interesting idea about how a novel lives. Once it's published, it's not just the property of the author. It belongs to readers. I wasn't actually talking to Margaret Atwood myself. Instead, I was at a reading for the book Hagseed, which was published a couple years ago by Margaret Atwood. That is a modern retelling of The Tempest for any of you who decide that you would want to read it again. It's an interesting book. The Tempest takes place, and it's kind of based at Stratford in Canada. Margaret Atwood's a Canadian author. So anyway, that's the first part. You'll see this novel. It's a dystopian future kind of novel. A lot of people really like it. And tomorrow we'll start talking about parts 2 and 3. So I hope you all have a good, safe day. Wash your hands and be healthy. Bye.